resolution. So, Marisa, thank you very much for coming tonight. Hey guys. Oh, I'm a mess tonight, I'm going to warn you. So before I start on the whole Lindbergh thing in Ellis Parker, I don't know how many of you are familiar with who Ellis Parker even is. God, that's one. A lot of times people are like, who? So I'll give you a little bit of background on him, just a very brief thing. So he was our Burlington County's first chief of detectives. He worked from the late 1800s till about 1940 in that capacity. He started out when he was only 18 years old, never went to school for such a job. He wanted to play a violin for his life. He wanted to be a musician. And one night after a barn dance, somebody stole his wagon and horse with the violin in it when he went back inside to get paid, which posed a really big problem. Now his instrument is gone, so no more dances, and the wagon and the horse belonged to his dad. So he found it, went to the police, told them somebody took it, showed them right where it was, and they said, we don't have anybody that's capable of this. Do you want a job? And he said, sure. Basically, he took it for money. That was it. I didn't really realize that he was going to be stuck in that position for the rest of his career. He ended up solving 288 out of 300 crimes throughout his career. Became known as the Sherlock Holmes of America. You have an idea of how people thought of him and his career. And this is at a time, there's no DNA, there's no fingerprinting, nothing like we have today. He was able to do it all basically by common sense and logic, knowing how to talk to people and just listening to what was going on around him. So later in his career, he gets involved with the Lindbergh Kidnapping case. This is the timeline of the Lindbergh Kidnapping. Right? So when you hear about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and everything that went on, it seems like it takes place very, very quickly, but it really doesn't. It all starts in 1932, and Ellis Parker's involvement in everything doesn't end until 1940 when he dies. So it's an 8-year story that I'm going to try and cram into about 40 minutes for you guys. But this is the basic timeline of what goes on. Which I will get into the whole thing. I just kind of put it up there so you can sort of see that it's not this short, quick, and concise story like it sometimes is made out to be, or it comes across. It actually takes quite some time for everything to play out. So what ends up happening is the Lindbergh baby, Charles Lindbergh Jr., is kidnapped on March 1st of 1932 from his home in Hopewell. The Lindberghs had a summer home there. It was pretty secluded, it was under construction, and they typically were there on the weekends. There's something to keep in mind throughout this whole scenario. Usually they left Sunday night, early Monday morning to go back to their permanent residence, and were only there on the weekends. The kidnapping takes place on March 1st, which is a Monday. So they probably weren't meant to be in the house. And Charles Jr. is taken from his nursery upstairs. Nobody realizes it until a couple hours later. The nanny goes in realizing it's extremely quiet and discovers there's no baby and the window's open. Well, where did he go? And there's a ransom note on the window. So this is a timeline of what goes on. So around 9 o'clock in the evening, the Lindberghs hear wood cracking. Didn't think anything of it. It's a house under construction. Shutters are hanging off the windows, and it was a cold and windy night. So hearing wood cracking in an old farmhouse, nothing out of the norm. By about 10 o'clock, the nanny discovers that the baby has gone missing. They call the police, and about 40 minutes later, the Hopewell police chief arrives on the site, and the police start searching the grounds. The interesting thing is, when the very first officer to show up on the scene writes in his little logbook that the first thing he notices are 2 sets of footprints leaving the house, coming from below the baby's window. Now, if you know anything about the outcome of the Lindbergh kidnapping trial, there's only one person ever convicted. So God only knows who the second individual could be. But he does note that there are 2 sets of footprints coming away from the house. By 11 o'clock, they set up checkpoints on the borders of New Jersey and New York. They figure there are tire tracks, so they figure whoever kidnapped the baby has them in a vehicle and will be trying to transport him across state lines. So trying to find a vehicle that seems a little suspicious, potentially has a screaming child in the back, that looks like the Lindbergh baby would be really good at that point. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. They do not find the baby that way. About 15 minutes later, some other people arrive on the scene. Corporal Joseph Wolf from the state police, Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf, that is Stormin Norman from Iraq's dad. He was our first state chief of police. And Frank Kelly, who was a CSI officer at the time. One thing to note is Schwarzkopf and Parker do not get along. You will hear that repeatedly through this whole story. They butt heads a lot. So while all of this is going on, Charles Lindbergh is leading the investigation, which is a little suspicious to begin with, because most people are aware that anytime there is a crime committed, the family of the victim is not running the investigation. Lindbergh was calling all the shots. If he didn't want you on the property, you weren't there. He was telling them where to search, he was telling them who to talk to, so it was a little crazy. So all of this is going on, they're trying to figure out where is this child. At this point, it's strictly a kidnapping case. There has been no child discovered. Parker starts talking about what could this be? And he says that he believes whoever kidnapped the baby knew the Lindberghs, was an acquaintance in one way, shape, or form. So they had to know that they would still be in the house that morning or that evening. They typically shouldn't be there. He was completely left out of the investigation. The state did not ask him initially to help. At one point he went to the state and said, hey, here I am, you have this world-renowned detective, and they said, this is out of your jurisdiction, it's not in Burlington County. And his response was, so people call me from other countries to help with cases. Here's the biggest case in the world, and you're not gonna ask me questions. So he was completely left out of the whole thing. Some people believe that one of the reasons that he was left out of it was the state police was a fairly new entity in the early 1930s. And not long before that, they botched a really big murder trial. They convicted a man who was innocent, that they later found out. So a lot of people in the state were very skeptical about the need for a state police force. They felt like their local police force was doing just fine. Why are we paying for a state police force if they're gonna just mess up all the time anyway? This was their way of proving that they're needed. If they could solve the biggest case in the world, we now need a state police. So they didn't really want him there. This is a copy of the ransom note that was left on the window. That little mark on the bottom, that circle with all the little parentheses things around it, that is like the calling card for ransom notes for this case. In the letter they say anything that would come directly from the kidnapper will have that mark on it. That's how you know that it's a real ransom note, real correspondence, and not somebody else kind of getting involved there. One thing that Parker brings up about the ransom note, you'll notice if you can read it, it's written in broken English. A lot of the spelling is wrong. It's written as if somebody speaks German as their initial language. The other thing that's interesting is the amount of money that they ask for. They ask for $50,000 and they tell them how they want it broken down, what kind of bills they want. So, $25,000 in 20s, $15,000 in 10s, others in $10,000 in $5 bills, and they want it in 2 to 4 days. Which is quite interesting when it's the Lindberghs. $50,000 in the early 1930s, even into like the 40s, most kidnapping cases that come up, that's the amount of money they ask for. It's like a standard amount of money to ask for. Most people, they figure can come up with it one way or another. And Parker always thought, this is the Lindberghs. They have way more money than $50,000 to give to you. Mrs. Lindbergh's father is one of the wealthiest men in America at this time. So why would the guy that kidnapped the baby not ask for more money? He's not in it for the cash. There's some other motive going on, which kind of sends up some red flags for Parker. So who does get involved in the initial investigation? So Parker decides, even though the state won't let him in, he's going to investigate on his own. So he's going to basically read all the newspaper articles, listen to everything he possibly could, and he's going to try and come up with a solution and present it to the governor. So in his investigation, the key players turn out to be Colonel Schwarzkopf, Governor Harold Hoffman, and Paul Wendell. Paul Wendell's the biggest player. That all get involved in what he is going to do. So he starts investigating this case. So his first step is he asks Paul Wendell for help. Now, Paul Wendell is not an upright, wonderful person in his own right. He is a disbarred lawyer. He had issues with Mrs. Lindbergh from previous encounters, and he was a little full of himself, put it that way. And he actually called Ellis Parker. They had known each other just through court dealings, and he had called him at his house anonymously, and Parker recognized his voice. And he said, "I know who took the Lindbergh baby," and hung up the phone. So Ellis called him back and said, "I want you to help me investigate this case." So the first thing when he asks Wendell to help, Wendell says, "There's people in Chicago that have the baby." He's saying the mob is involved in this whole scenario. So Parker gives him money to go to Chicago to come back with either the people that took the baby, or at least some answers. He comes back with no money and no information. This happens twice. Every time he would come back, he had more information that nobody should really know. It was stuff that the police were finding out, but he just kept gabbing about everything that was going on. And at one point, Parker actually said, if Wendell keeps talking, he's going to convict himself of this crime. He's involved in one way, shape, or form, or at least knows who is. So he dives right in and says, Wendell's going to help me solve the case and convict himself at the same time, is his logic. So how is Paul Wendell connected to all of this, is what he's figuring out. So one, he knows what tools were used to access the nursery. He also claims that there was a Hopewell resident who had a yellow light on their front porch that night. Now, the road that led to the Lindbergh's house had two other houses on it, these little tiny like shacks, but they were very, very far spaced apart. Nobody's going down, it was a dirt road. Nobody's going down the road unless you have a reason to go down the road. How would you know a light was on somebody's porch on that particular day unless you were there? And Wendell has no reason to be there. He also keeps moving not long after the date of the kidnapping. He sells his house, he moves to New York, he rents apartments, then he was in a hotel room. So it's kind of like, why would you move around if you don't want anybody to find you, right? And he likes to show that he has power over other people. And that continues throughout the whole thing, pretty much until Wendell's death. He continuously likes to show that he's above other people. Who better to show you have power over than the hero of America at the time, right? So he really thinks Wendell is involved in one way, shape, or form. So his second step is he asks Colonel Schwarzkopf for information and access to the crime scene. The access is denied. However, what they do for Parker is they ask him to head the New Jersey Department of Motor Vehicles investigation of the case. So what that does is, even though they're not giving access to the crime scene, he now has access to the documents. And he's privy to information. And he can start asking questions about the crime scene without actually going to it. So it's kind of letting him in, but not completely letting him in. And he has an assistant while he's there, this gentleman there, that's Gus Lockwood. Gus Lockwood will play in big time near the end of this story, so keep his name in the back of your head, because he kind of goes silent for a while, and then he pops back up with some big stuff going on. So, unfortunately, May 12th of 1932, the Lindbergh baby is found dead. The baby's found dead about a mile away from the house in the middle of the woods. Two truck drivers are driving down the street. One decides he needs to go to the bathroom, so they pull over in the middle of the night. He walks almost a mile into the woods to pee. I don't know why. You're on an abandoned road. It makes no sense. And magically stumbles over the Lindbergh baby. Now, the interesting thing is, once he discovers this baby, they bring Charles Lindbergh out to the crime scene. He identifies the child. I do not have pictures of the crime scene because they are very, very disturbing. This child is not recognizable. Right? It is literally bones and just black whatever. But he's able to identify him as his son. While they're still investigating, he has the baby cremated and buried. And nobody says anything about that, which is also a little suspicious. And Parker thinks, that's a little strange. You should not be, that's your main piece of evidence is the baby's body. And you now just allowed somebody to destroy it. So Parker really criticizes the police once the baby is found dead. He really felt like that the police did not do what they should to have the baby returned alive and didn't follow up with it properly for being a kidnapping case. So he goes after the state police for not finding the baby alive. He is given the chance to examine the body not long after it was discovered, and he says that it's more decomposed than it should be. Now, the baby was missing for 2 months, about 2.5 months. And he said, in the cold weather outside for 2.5 months, the baby shouldn't look that way. This is the wrong kid. And the interesting thing is, there was an orphanage not too far away that also had a child missing that was around the same size. So, and that child supposedly has never been found. So there was some suspicion Parker was thinking it's that other child, not the Lindbergh baby. And Wendell goes on and insists that it is not the Lindbergh baby. He is dead set that it is the wrong child and lets Parker pretty much know that. So it takes quite a while for them to find anyone. All right, so this is May of 32. It takes till September of 1934 to arrest anybody for this crime. They are searching high and low. They end up arresting this gentleman here. This is Richard Hopman. Richard Hopman is arrested because he spent the ransom money at a gas station. He's from New York. He lived in Brooklyn. Was dirt poor, lived there with his wife and 2 kids, was a carpenter by trade. And his story is that a friend of his named Isidore Finch left him a shoebox full of cash in his garage and said, I want you to keep this money safe for me. I'm going to Germany, but I'll be back. Well, it turns out Isidore Finch never returns. He pays cash for his trip over to Germany, and he dies of tuberculosis while he's there. So he never comes back. So Hopman figures, I need gas in my car, I'm grabbing $20 and I'm going to the gas station out of this shoebox. Well, all of the ransom money had been recorded. And Hopman spends it, gas station attendant recognizes the serial number and turns him into the police. They were really on the lookout for all of the money because the federal government, without realizing they were doing it, did something really great for this case. They put out a thing that all gold bills, coins, and all of the gold bills out there had to be turned in to the Federal Reserve, which meant the ransom money needed to be spent very quickly or not at all. So somebody had to spend it within like 6 months in order for it to have any value to it. If they didn't spend it, it was worthless money, because then if they turn it in, they're now in trouble for not doing what they're supposed to with the federal government, let alone being in trouble for having ransom money. So that's how Hoffman ends up getting caught. He insists he knows nothing about how much money is in the box. He has no idea where it comes from, and he's never heard of the Lindberghs. No idea what anybody's talking about. But he still is arrested September 19th of 1934, and he does have some suspicious activities going on. He lies about how many gold certificates he has. He does say he doesn't know how many are there, but yet when they count them, they said, there's like, $30,000 here. He goes, yeah, it sounds right, but he really doesn't know. He stops working as a carpenter not long after the ransom money was paid. He put money into investments and was living off of those. He also began renting a home in Manhattan not long after all this happens. And they discover that he's illegally in the country and that he has a criminal record in Germany. Now, his criminal record in Germany is nothing like kidnapping and murder. It's petty theft, things like that. But he does have a record, and his first time trying to come to the United States, he got onto a boat. Somebody found out he was on the boat, kicked him off, back to Germany he went. So the next time he got on a boat to come to America, nobody realized he was on it. He made his way over, and he kind of snuck into the country. So he has a couple red flags of his own. And he is charged with felony murder. Now, his charge is interesting too, because the only way you can get a death sentence in the state of New Jersey is to be charged with first-degree murder. So, felony murder is that you committed the crime, the murder, while trying to commit another crime. So the thought was he was trying to steal something from the Lindberghs and kill the baby. Or he should be charged with kidnapping and the baby ends up dying accidentally, is what they're going with initially. But because there is a murder involved in one way, shape, or form, and they say it's a murder felony, they could get the death sentence on him. And that's what they wanted. Now, the interesting thing is, what they claimed was that he stole the baby's sleeping clothes and ended up killing him in the process. Who in the world would steal a baby's outfit? Well, that's just a stupid crime. And the odd thing is, if it was really the Lindbergh baby they found in the woods, the clothes were given to the Lindberghs that were around the baby, so they were returned. So then it's not really, it just makes no sense. But there he is. He's going on trial. So he goes on trial in January of 1935. He has a state-appointed lawyer who came to court drunk every day. He was a total disaster. His prosecution has some evidence. One of the pieces is $14,000 of ransom money that's still sitting around at Hoffman's house. They claim he has similar handwriting to the ransom note. One of the things Parker realized with the ransom note is when they did the handwriting analysis on Hoffman, he corrected all the spelling. So they gave him the ransom note and said, copy this. Well, if you're just reading something and then going to another piece of paper, you're writing it as you know how to write. Well, he spelled everything correctly. And they told him, no, you need to spell it wrong, just like this letter. And he's like, but I know how to spell those words. And they told him, no, you have to write it exactly how it is on the paper. And Parker said, that's because he didn't write it. If you wrote it, it would have been spelled right in the first place. It was his logic there. They also bring the ladder that was used to get to the window into play. There on the bottom is a picture of the ladder. It was in 3 sections, so it could be pieced together at the house for easier transport. The bottom picture is it up against the window. And supposedly a piece of wood on the ladder matches the wood in Hoffman's attic. And being a carpenter, they figured he could make a ladder like that from scratch without any problems. They also found the chisel that was used to pry open the window. They claim it was missing from his toolbox. And there were 2 eyewitnesses that we'll get to in a minute. So there were a couple weaknesses to this prosecution. One was there's no fingerprints. Not one fingerprint was discovered at the crime scene to link him to it. There's no evidence at the Hoffman house to say that the Lindbergh baby had ever been to his house. So even if Hoffman did take the baby, what did he do with this child for 2 months before he turned up dead? He had to take him somewhere at one point. There's a lack of forensic evidence linking him to the case as well. And their big question is, why is there only one person on trial? If there's 2 sets of footprints leading from that window, how come Hoffman doesn't have a friend arrested with him? Where's the other guy? So there's a few holes there. Hoffman's defense, their debate is going to be that it was an inside job, and Hoffman is not familiar with the Lindberghs or that place at all. They also discredit the witnesses that the prosecution has. There are two witnesses. One of them was an older gentleman who claims he was able to see Hoffman in the middle of the night in a specific car driving down the road. When he went into a specific office, they put a vase of flowers on a table across the room and asked him what was on the table, and he said a hat. He was blind as a bat. So he didn't see anything. The other witness that they had, when the police went to talk to him the first time, it was a young gentleman. He said he didn't see anything, he was asleep. They went back a week later. Magically, he saw the exact same car that Hoffman drives. He could describe what he looked like behind the wheel. And he had $500 deposited into his bank account. So Parker said, well, they're no good. And the New York Herald was paying for exclusive stories to the prosecution, which is a no-no. So one of the bad things that they did, here's Hoffman with his lawyer and him in court, was they decided to put him on the stand, which was horrible decision. You can watch video footage of the trial. It is a circus. And you can see Hoffman, and he looks flustered as heck. But he comes across as being very, very arrogant on the stand. Part of it, when you listen to it in today's, out of the context of it, he has no idea what's going on. He doesn't understand the questions all the time because he does not speak good English. So sometimes he's asking them to repeat the question and the lawyers are saying, no, you'll answer the question. He's like, I don't know how. I don't know what you're saying to me. I can't answer the question. And sometimes he will say something back and they repeat it to him and he says, that's not what I mean. So there was a big communication barrier that made him come across as a complete jerk, because he was very, very frustrated while he was on the stand. So it didn't bode very well for him. So while Hoffman's going to trial, what is Parker doing during all of this, right? There's already somebody arrested, so what is he going to do? So he still believes that Hoffman is not the guy that they are supposed to be arresting and that Wendell is involved. So in April of '35, he gets permission and goes to visit Hoffman in prison. He takes his secretary, Anna Bading, with him because she speaks fluent German. She goes into the prison dressed as a man because women are not allowed, even if it's for business. They cannot go into a man's cell. So she goes in dressed as a man with a hat and everything on, goes in and translates their entire meeting. Parker comes out believing that Hoffman is 100% innocent and really has not only is he not involved, he doesn't have a clue what's going on. So he also starts re-questioning some of the witnesses on his own and starts talking to family and friends of Hoffman, Wendell, the Lindberghs, and trying to piece things together. When he talks to Wendell's son at one point and says, do you think your dad could have done this? He says, yeah, I think he probably could have pulled that off. So obviously his son didn't like him too much. He also discovered that Isidore Finch paid cash for his ticket to Germany. He goes through all of the trial records and he attacks Hoffman's lawyer in the newspaper and says that man should be disbarred, he should not be stepping foot into a courtroom. One of the other things he criticizes is the way that the jury is being publicized. The jury was staying right across the street from the courthouse, where all the media stayed as well. So it was a big, big mess. The other person that he criticizes is this man named Arthur Kohler. Arthur Kohler was brought in as a wood expert to say that the wood from the ladder matches the wood from Hoffman's attic. His only thing he had to go on was the way the wood was planed. It's the only thing that matched. The color of the wood doesn't actually match. But they're planed the same way and are about the same length. And Parker said, if you know anything about woodworking, sir, if you put it, the garage, or the attic was planed and built well before the ladder. It was done on this type of planing machine. This was done on something else. You can have the exact same planing in 2 different time periods. It doesn't have to be the same piece of wood. And he discusses how it was probably a very long planned out crime. Whoever did it knew when to go, knew what they were going to be doing, and had it planned out. It wasn't a spur of the moment thing. So he ends up getting Hauptmann a stay of execution. He is found guilty, but he gets him a stay of execution at this point. By December of 35, Parker denies finding any evidence that would clear Hauptmann. Now, in the newspaper, the Courier Post, somebody writes a letter that says Ellis Parker is clearing Hauptmann's name. And Parker says, no, I don't have any new evidence against anybody. Because what Parker was like, he wasn't going to put out little bits and pieces here and there. He wasn't putting anything out there until he had all his ducks in a row and it was a solid case. And it was a slam dunk. So he just denies it up until that point. But the Governor Hauptmann, sets up a team to help him. So he gives 30 days to the state police to start to reinvestigate and see if they come up with anything new. And he gives Parker a team. He gives him fingerprint experts, handwriting experts, FBI agents, and everything you can imagine. Parker has it. He still can't make a slam dunk on the case. The state police say they come up with 0. They haven't found anything new, nothing to clear Hauptmann, nothing to convict somebody else. So what he ends up doing is he comes up with a plan. He's going to take matters into his own hands. So he's going to arrest Paul Wendell. I have arrest in quotes because he's not legally arresting anyone. Parker doesn't have that authority. What he does is he sends his son, Ellis Jr., and 3 ex-cons to New York, sits in a diner with them, and deputizes them, which he doesn't have the authority to do either. But they don't realize that. So they think they're acting legally to go and arrest Paul Wendell on embezzlement charges. He's wanted on embezzlement in Monmouth County. So they think they're going to arrest him on embezzlement. They are going to isolate and confine him in the basement of one of the gentleman's houses and get him to confess to the Lindbergh crime. They're then going to send the confession to Ellis Parker and take him into New Jersey for custody. Once you have a signed confession, you're good, right? Mm-hmm. So these are the gentlemen that are involved in this whole mess. Murray Bleefeld, the top there, he's a small-time criminal that owes Parker's favors. Parker helped out his brother at one point. So, and he was the guy who was going to watch Wendell. Where is he going? At what time? How could we find him? And we have Martin Schlossman and Harry Wise, who believe that everything is legal.